Of course, the impulse is to look at that and see like, well, see, Trump did this last week, and now this week we have a plane crash. It's a little more complex than that, right? As I, speak to you now, there is a live update from the New York Times that came out just 10 minutes ago. Sparse on information, but the information reads, live update. Control tower staffing was, quote, not normal during deadly crash, FAA report says. An internal report suggested that the controller on duty the night of the accident was doing a job usually handled by two people. And so what we are trying to show y'all is that that situation did not come from nowhere. And it is not a situation that is sadly particular to air traffic controllers. This is something that Mel and I hear in the worker interviews that we do in industries around the country, the crisis of deliberate understaffing in critical industries, including those that have a direct bearing on our own public safety. And like with the railroads Mel mentioned, to refresh your memories, a couple years ago, if we all recall, the U.S. was approaching its first potential railroad strike in 30 years. We had been interviewing railroad workers across the industry, engineers, conductors, signalmen, carmen, dispatchers, all of whom were telling us different versions of the same story, which is that the, corporate consolidation, the government deregulation, and the Wall Street takeover of the rail industry had created this sort of process that has built into a crisis over decades where, the railroads have become more profitable than ever by cutting their costs year after year after year. And so what does that mean? It means cutting labor costs, cutting safety costs, making those trains longer, heavier, piled with more dangerous cargo while having fewer and fewer workers on the trains and also fewer and fewer workers in the machine shops, checking the track, in the dispatch offices. The point is that when these layoffs happen, when these corporate restructurings happen, when these policies are implemented in key industries like logistics industries, like federal, aviation, you are not just firing people, you are removing layers of security that are there for a reason. And you're doing so for the benefit, the short-term benefit of higher profits, while the long-term costs are borne by the workers in those industries, the public that is being hurt by them, and even by the customers, who use those industries. Rail shippers are pissed off as rail workers are right now. So the point just being is that Mel and I hear this in education, teacher shortages, more students piled on to fewer teachers, leading to worse education outcomes, healthcare, hospital workers who have been burnt out before COVID, even more so since COVID, more patients piled onto fewer nurses, leading to declining quality of care, treating patients more like, just a kind of grist for the mill, get them in, get them out. This is a system-wide problem that we are seeing the effects of across the economy, and we can see it here in this tragic plane crash that has claimed the lives of nearly 70 people. And in fact, this is much like the horrific train accident that occurred in East Palestine, Ohio on February 3rd. The anniversary is coming up, the 2-year anniversary of that. And the workers on the railroads warned us that something like that would happen, and then it did, just like workers in the aviation industry, as Mel mentioned, have been warning us that something like this would happen, and now it has. But we have been sort of dancing on the lip of this volcano for a long time. We're just waking up to the reality now. And I just want to kind of underline this point by quoting from a really great Jacobin article that was published in 2023 by Joseph A. McCartan, titled "The U.S. is Facing a Growing Air Safety Crisis. We have Ronald Reagan to thank for that." And again, this was not published this week. This was published during the Biden administration. McCartan makes the very clear point that on March 15th, 2023, the Federal Aviation Administration held a safety summit in McLean, Virginia, Virginia, gathering more than 200 safety leaders from across American aviation to discuss ways to enhance flight safety. What prompted the unusual summit was, by the FAA's own admission, a, quote, string of recent safety incidents, several of which involved airplanes coming too close together during takeoff or landing. And McCartan also notes in that same article that a, quote, a recent internal study by the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Transportation found that 20 of 26 critical facilities, 77% of them, are staffed below the FAA's 85% threshold. So, like, again, don't get it twisted. Like, what Trump is doing is making the problem worse. It's pouring gasoline on the fire. But this fire was burning before Trump came into office. And Mel, as you said, you know, like, this is something that we've had workers in these industries, you know, decrying for many, many years. And this is also, like, something that, you know, like, we need to sort of have a long historical view on, right? Because as McCartan mentioned in that article, like, we do have Ronald Reagan to thank for a lot of this. And I just wanted to kind of, like, hover on that point for a second. Because, as we know, one of President Ronald Reagan's, like, most infamous acts in his first presidential term was to fire striking air traffic controllers, over 1,000 of them. It was a significant, massive percentage of the existing air traffic controller workforce in 1981. Not only did this sort of, like, unleash a new age of union busting across the private sector and elsewhere, but it also is directly relevant to what we're talking about here, because when you fire, you know, that many air traffic controllers, as Reagan did, this was 11,000, approximately 70% of the controller workforce at the time that Reagan fired in 1981, and then tried to replace. So, like, a point that maybe we don't think about, but that actually connects to the air traffic controller shortage now, is that when you, in 1 year, eliminate 70% of that workforce, and then you replace it with new hires in the next 2 to 3, 4 years, you are creating essentially a generational problem where those new hires in the 1980s are retiring, you know, in 30 years. And then the process starts again, where suddenly you have kind of a massive aging out of the existing workforce and a dire need to replace those understaffed agencies. So we are still feeling the staffing ripple effects and the safety impacts that has from Ronald Reagan's original firing of the air traffic controllers. We have not fixed that problem. And as we've said a number of times, like, air traffic controllers continue to be chronically understaffed, which means all of us who fly are flying, you know, like, at the mercy and, like, you know, our safety hangs on the overworked shoulders of understaffed air traffic controllers across the country right now. And I don't know. Does that make you feel safe, Mel? It doesn't make me feel safe.
No, I take the train. I already have enough air anxiety. The reality is, I think, as well, when you're talking about, particularly with the PATCO strike, but in any industry where there is high turnover, there is not really a space for this sort of concentration of expertise, you know. And this is and PATCO is a huge example of this, where you have, you know, career air traffic controllers who have amassed, you know, collectively hundreds of years of collective experience in how to work this industry and do it safely. And, you know, you're training new hires who may or may not have the same sort of experience, or you're shuffling folks into these departments. You're not going to get the same level standard of expertise, right? We see it in healthcare. We see it in really any industry that has high turnover, from the people who make your coffee drinks all the way up to the engineers who make your planes that you ride on, right? So this is a huge problem. Well, and we'll discuss this a little bit later when we're talking about what's going on in the federal government as well. But that is an important point to make, that What we're seeing with this lack of staffing is really a lack of expertise, the ability to have internally these checks and balances that create the safety conditions that we rely on in order for us to live our lives without fear of falling out of the sky, literally. And so that's a really important point here. And again, unions like the AFA-CWA and the machinists who work with Boeing are acutely aware of that and are willing and able to sort of like bolster this workforce, right? But you cannot attract a new generation of smart, capable, hardworking, willing people to buy into this industry and provide their expertise to this industry if you don't have a competitive job to offer them, right? And that happens a lot in healthcare as well, right? So it's kind of a top-down problem. It's not that folks don't want to do these jobs. It's really, is this job going to be doable? Am I going to be able to pay my bills? Is my family going to be okay? Am I going to be able to get a pension? Am I going to be able to do this job to the best of my ability without working 120 hours a week and get paid nothing, really, functionally for it? So, again, these unions are really acutely aware of this issue and are bargaining hard to solve these problems. Unfortunately, in many cases, they're coming up against an intractable management who cares more about increasing profits for shareholders than actually, creating a workplace that is competitive and that is also operating at a higher standard.